Welcome. I'm Samantha Stone, founder of the Marketing Advisory Network, and I'm very happy you've joined me to talk about mapping personas to your CRM system. During today's session, we're going to talk a little bit about what a persona is, make sure we all have a shared definition. We'll make sure to talk about what should be included in your persona, how to conduct research that will provide meaningful personas that you can act upon, and of course, what are the best methods for mapping personas to your CRM system. Everything I'm going to share with you today is based on my own personal experience of having done more than 30 persona projects, but more importantly, the best practices based on a benchmark study that we did of over 100 organizations. We looked at the practices as they relate to personas for those that exceeded their revenue and lead goals, compared to those that met their revenue and lead goals, and also compared to those that missed their revenue and lead goals. So everything I'm going to share with you today is a validated roadmap, not only based on my personal experience, but that of more than 100 organizations. Let's start by making sure we have a shared definition of a persona. Personas are fictional representations of our ideal customers. They're compositive market research, and they remind us of the unique human element of our target audience. And that is a lot more buzzwords than I'd like to use in any one discussion. So let's get a little bit more real in how we define personas. I want to take a minute to talk about the difference between a profile and a persona. And I'd like to introduce you to Anne to make this point. Anne is one of my grandmothers. She lived in the suburbs of Connecticut. She had a dog. She had grandchildren and children. She worked for the school committee. She also worked in an office. She was an amazing cook, and she was excellent at arts and crafts and sewing and anything that had to be created. What I just described to you is Anne's profile. And it is, in fact, what most marketers are very good at capturing about our prospects. However, if you really wanted to market to Anne, you need to know so much more than just her profile if your goal is to be relevant and efficient in your outreach to her. What you really need to know about Anne is that she was pretty self-centered. All the decisions that she made in her life revolved around how things impacted her. For example, if she was even asking my sister or I about our dating, it wasn't really just because she was interested. She was thinking in her head, would she need to set another table setting at the next holiday meal? Anne was ferocious in her love and her passion for her family. And that meant she was ferocious and passionate in how she communicated. She would defend it staunchly, even amongst ourselves. She didn't talk to my father for almost a decade, and no one can even remember why. Anne was fiery and passionate, and she never backed down from a fight, no matter who it was with. She was also an amazing cook, as I mentioned. I still, to this day, drool over the food that she would prepare. But if while she was cooking, you even thought about eating a snack, she would chase you out of the house because she had slaved over the phone and over the cooking and over the preparation for this meal. That is Anne's persona. And that understanding allows us to market to her with visuals and offers and value propositions that are going to get her attention. Now, I want to contrast that to Frances, who is my other grandmother. Frances also happened to live in the suburbs of Connecticut. She had a cat, Gussie, not a dog, but nonetheless, she had a pet. She had a couple of grandchildren and children of her own. She worked in an office. If you knew nothing but Frances's profile, you would think that she and Anne were identical. They both lived in the same location, did the same type of work. They both had similar family structures. But there's a huge difference between Anne and Frances. Both love their grandchildren deeply. But Frances had a very different persona. She was the kind of person who would go to a restaurant, order a meal, the chef would deliver the wrong thing, she'd be allergic to it, and she would still eat it and tell the chef how fabulous it was. She avoided conflict like the plague. So yes, she loved her children fiercely, but she was the woman who would go and cook. And by the way, I was very fortunate. Both grandmothers were fabulous cooks. And she wouldn't chase you out of the kitchen if she thought that you might be hungry. In fact, if she thought you were hungry, even if you didn't say anything, she would stop what you were doing, open up her watermelon, cut it into little pieces, take each individual seed out for you. She was the ultimate in putting other people first. Anne or Frances were not better than each other. They just different personas. And if I want to market to them and I want to sell to them, understanding their core drivers, their core personality attributes will make me so much more effective. Now, if you think that all grandmothers are the same, you might be thinking that all IT managers are the same or all CPAs are the same, and it's not true. Just like all grandmothers are different, so are all the other types of people we sell to in a B2B environment. And it's these differences that allow us to be more effective marketers. So let's talk a little bit about what belongs in a persona. Now that we have a little bit better sense that it's something much, much more than just a profile, let's talk about what belongs in that. What you need to think about, so this is the results of the benchmark study that I shared with you. And what this shows is those organizations that are most successful in their marketing, both by revenue and amount of leads that are generated, they include a whole number of different kinds of things in their personas. Yes, they include demographic information like someone's job, their age, maybe where they live, perhaps, or where they work. But they also include their role in the buying process. They include buying preferences, in fact, twice as often as those who miss their goal. They look at organizational priorities in the context, and they look at drivers and motivators. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand. They also look at fears. Not only what do people want to achieve, what are they afraid of? What do they regret? What are the challenges that they face each and every day? All of that is incredibly important. They also look at things like content preferences and KPI metrics. How are this person measured? If I'm selling to consumers, I might be thinking about how am I measuring my personal goals. In the context of a B2B environment, how do they feel successful? What are they trying to achieve? And of course, there are other things that you might want to consider depending on the context of your business. But it's important here, the key takeaway is that what you want to know is as much as you can, not only about what someone does, but why they do it. And if we really want to understand that, we have to do our homework. Those who exceed revenue and lead goals use far more different methods to collect insight than those who miss their goals. We need to look inside our databases at the data trends that we can find. We need to look at third-party data. We need to look at research reports. We need to look at what our competitors are doing. We need to read studies. We need to interview our sales team and our executives and others in our organization, like those in support. But the number one biggest differentiator of those who are successful and those who fail is the use of qualitative research for both customers and non-customers. 70% of organizations who missed their revenue and lead goals did not conduct qualitative persona interviews. This is really important and very meaningful. The only way to truly understand people and to segment by groups is to understand the why. And you can't survey your way into the why. There are things that people will say to you that they would not put down in writing in a survey. There are things that you can capture from the tone of voice that someone is sharing with you, the virtual body language that you can see in a conversation. In a bi-directional qualitative research interview, you can ask follow-up questions. You also get more intuitive, spur-of-the-moment results because somebody in a conversation isn't going to overthink their response, as they might do in a survey type setting. I want to give you a real example. I'm doing some work recently for a company that makes lab equipment. And they sell to lab managers. It's the person they interact with from their sales team. It's the person who signs their order. It's the person that is really completely involved in the buying process of their products. So they wanted to understand their lab manager persona better. And they wanted to understand, are there multiple personas within the lab manager community? And when we set out to do the project, they gave me a list of lab managers for me to interview. And there are, in fact, different types of lab managers, which the research helped us uncover, and that was incredibly helpful. But there was something more. We found out that there was other people involved in the buying process that were a little hidden from this manufacturer. First of all, lab managers almost never actually used the equipment that the manufacturer was supplying. Their lab technicians did. And every one of those lab managers relied on lab technicians to test the comfort, ease of use, and effectiveness of the equipment that they sold, even though the vendor didn't interact with those lab technicians directly. This was really important insight. We also learned that before deciding who they would consider as a new manufacturer supplier for equipment, that they all had a trusted reseller that they reached out to. And that reseller developed the short list of manufacturers that this person would consider, even if they didn't place the order directly with the reseller. We would not have learned this information if we had not had qualitative interviews. And this information was essential for improving our sales and buying process mapping for this lab equipment manufacturer. Now, at this point, when I'm talking to people, most people are aware of and they can see the difference between a profile and a persona, and they can understand why the type of research we need to do is multifaceted. It includes both data analysis as well as qualitative research. And people start to ask, how many personas do I need? How many am I going to have? And here's the truth. Unfortunately, I cannot tell you how many personas you're going to have until we do the research. But what I can tell you is that patterns will exist in that for most single product or service companies, there are 3 to 5 primary personas that they will end up developing. And that it's important, like I share with you from that lab manager example, that you not only focus on one individual, but the full buying committee, all the influencers who play a role in determining which products and services are used. That's the user. In the example I gave you, that was the lab technicians. It's the economic buyer whose budget pays for the product or service that you're selling. It's other influencers in the organization. In this case, it was a reseller. Is purchasing involved? Does legal have a role? Who else influences the decision process? You may even have a champion, person who's most likely to forward and push the organization towards evaluating your product and services. The fact is, by not understanding the full buyer committee, we're not able to market effectively. And that's exactly why so much of the people who miss their revenue and lead goals do so, because they're not doing the qualitative research. They don't actually fully understand the entire buying influencing committee. They only understand the people that interact directly with them and their salespeople. And they're missing an incredible opportunity. 70% of companies who miss revenue and lead goal do not account for the full buying committee with their personas. And they're not the model that I want to focus on. Now, I want to give you an example of this. I did some work for a customer that sold to SharePoint administrators. technical people who were very good at administrating SharePoint, and they had a complex job and a lot of things that they did. But here's the thing. SharePoint admins didn't actually have any budget. They had to seek budget approval from somewhere else. Now, the challenge is what our research shows was that the person who owns the budget for SharePoint activity really doesn't want to talk to the vendor of a SharePoint administration project. It doesn't raise their radar. It's not high enough on their priority list. Yet they need to be convinced to part with their money. So what do? What this organization did was we built a champion kit. We helped the SharePoint administrator who was very good at running SharePoint, but very bad at selling internally, be more successful at advocating for their needs. So let's assume for the moment that we write down our personas, we've done our research, we have a good sense of who it is that's important to our buying process. I want to talk a little bit about how we use personas. And the research shows us that the most effective organizations not only use personas in marketing, which isn't obvious, for things like messaging and sales training, but they also use them in other parts of the organization that might surprise you. For example, with their designers. On the surface, that sounds a little counterintuitive, right? Designers use our brand guidelines and they're sort of told the value message, and their job is to help visualize it in an enticing and interesting way. Do they really need to understand personas? The truth is, they absolutely do, because they need to appeal to specific audiences. The density of the visuals on the page, which images are selected, understanding the emotional motivators and fears and challenges of their buyers makes them more effective at doing that. Those organizations who exceed revenue and lead goals, 47% of them do this. And I apologize, it's cut off on the screen, but those who miss their goals, only 4% do. You've done all the work for the research. It's really important that you use it. And not just there. Let's talk about product development or service development, for example. This is an area that may not be obvious, but let me talk to you about an example of this that just came up recently. I have a client who sells a product that helps manage workforce management. So these are people who are in the field who are doing technical tasks. And the people who are in the field doing these jobs, we did some interviewing of them. And I'll be honest, they have really no influence in the buying process. They don't have budget. They don't evaluate the products or tools. They don't recommend them. They're really, really segregated from any vendor selection process. However, they are users of the tool and they do impact the adoption. And so we talked to these people. And one of the things that we learned is that they are tracked literally every second of the day. They have GPS tracking that determines, are they in the restroom taking a break, or where are they physically located? How long have they been at jobs? And this information collection is essential to being more efficient in schedule optimization and some other things that this vendor does. However, the people who are being monitored are really getting tired of that. And while they understand theoretically why they need to be tracked, one of the things that is very frustrating for them is that across all of the interactions they have with their management team, all they seem to get is negative feedback. We're late, you're behind schedule, you've missed this, you're getting a call back. They only hear when things are negative. And what they really want and what they really care about is customer satisfaction. And so they want to see the good things, not just the bad things. And by product development understanding this, they can display information in a way that is more likely to drive positive outcomes and adoption than not understanding it. For example, I can present the number of jobs left to do today in red. I can also present the number of jobs completed today in green. Both things display the exact same data, but one has a positive way of displaying it and the other a negative. Because this organization understands the persona of the person who is being monitored by their technology, They have the opportunity to design it in a way that's going to make them most motivated. And that's a differentiator for them. Of course, we also need to use this for demand generation, right? We want to segment our database into the most appropriate personas so that we can campaign to people not only based on what their job is, but why they do it. But in fact, not mapping to our database and not segmenting is the biggest mistake we're making in marketing. We are doing all this work to understand our buyers, and then we're still pulling our lists by title, industry, and size of company. And we do that because it's easier, because it's data that we have readily available. But it's insufficient, and it doesn't have to be this way. We can and we must go the last mile to surface who our personas are, not just in our lists, but also in how we expose information to our salespeople. When they are following up on a lead, it is not only important that the salesperson understand the lead source, but they understand what we know about that person, who they are, and what that means. Companies who exceed their revenue and lead goals are almost 3.5 times as likely to segment their database by persona-related fields other than demographic or firmographic criteria than those who miss their goals. This is a huge opportunity, and it's a challenging opportunity, but it makes a big difference. We must find ways to take into account priorities, motivators, and personality attributes when we're tagging contacts in our database. I know that sounds logical, and I also know how hard it is to do that. But there are 3 mechanisms that we can use to make it an achievable goal to map contacts by persona, not just their demographic or firmographic information. First of all, start with what you have. We do know somebody's title. We likely know the size company they belong to in their industry. These are helpful signals and we should use them, but they're not sufficient alone. I want to give you an example. One of the things that we did is I worked for an email security and continuity organization. And at the time, we sold exclusively exchange administrators. And it turns out exchange administrators were, in fact, economic buyers, users of the system, and the primary purchasing contacts and champions. They really represented the entire buying committee in most of the organizations that were sold to. But herein lied the problem. If all we did was look at their title exchange administrators, they all seemed the same. They did the same job. But when we went out and actually did research, we found that all exchange administrators were not the same. They had very different outlooks on their job as it related to email. And that was a critically important differentiator for us. There had people who came from a security-oriented mindset, and everything they did was really about security, and that was where their core value was. And while every exchange administrator cares about security, the people for which that is their primary driver, their core passion, cared about a different set of things than the person who was a generalist, who email was one of a million things on their list. We also had people who were more compliance-oriented. We had efficiency-oriented exchange administrators. By understanding the motivators and personality attributes that went along with each of these motivators, we would be more effective in our marketing. But how could we know that when all we had in our database was the title, their size of their organization? It wasn't obvious from that. So we did something that used information we already had, which is we looked at the content that the people in our database had consumed. And we'd published a series of content around different themes. And we were able to map about half the database just based on the content that they had consumed. It was a really great place for us to start. Another technique is to survey our database. Ask them, and ask them questions that are based on the research that you've done. You can ask them questions like select from a specific list their most important priority. You can ask them, how do you feel most satisfied work? The survey technique does require that you've done the research ahead of time and that you have a set of responses that you know are associated with individual personas, so then you can map it. I often recommend when using this technique, by the way, that you start with just one question. That way you'll get more people responding to it. It's a little bit less overwhelming. And if you do start with one question, I recommend you do it around a prioritization question. Using this technique, we also mapped about another 10% of the database. So it may not be a huge number or percent of your database that you're mapping with this technique, but over time, when you do this, it adds up and it makes a big difference. Another really important tool that you have at your disposal is your sales team. Your sales team talks to more buyers in a day than most marketers do in a month, probably most marketers do in a quarter. And they are having a conversation. And if they're well trained, they have the ability to tell you what that contact's persona is. So if you can reward them for that behavior and set expectations that not only do they say what company this person belongs to and is there a valid opportunity or not, but also who their persona is, and you expect that as a field they complete in the database, you're going to get another big chunk of your database completed on an ongoing basis. Lastly, you have the opportunity to use forms you are already using to collect information that would be most relevant for your audience. You're already asking them to complete forms to register for a web seminar or to attend a conference or to download a white paper. And in fact, most of the questions that you're asking are really about internal routing and not really about buying signals, what state they're from or what country or what their last name is even. All of those kinds of questions are really about helping us route to people internally. And we need to ask those questions. But we also have the opportunity to ask something that is very meaningful from a persona perspective while they're there. And it doesn't add any significance to the weight of the form itself. The example you'll see here is a construction software company. And you'll see they've added a question, what's your biggest business challenge? This question helps them understand the persona of the person who has come to their site. And with progressive profiling techniques, over time, as you interact with your audience, you can collect one question, two questions, three questions, and get better and better at it. What I described to you is hard work, and I won't pretend it's not. But it is worth the effort. Those organizations who exceed revenue and lead goals document their personas. They have higher conversion rates on specific campaigns where those insights are used, and they are more profitable. Not to mention their customers are more satisfied. Now, I know this is hard work, so in addition to the presentation here today, there are other resources that you can use. We've created an ultimate persona interview guide to help you with one of the most important, but also biggest, most challenging aspects of doing persona research, which is the qualitative interview process. And this guide steps you through what questions to ask, who to ask, how to incent people to participate. You'll also be able to access the benchmark that I referenced to you and the full set of responses and summary results from that, and also developed a persona optimization framework. All of these are available at unleashpossible.com and don't require any registration. Please go use them and provide feedback. We'd love to get your perspective on if they're helpful or not. I hope today has been a helpful presentation to help you think about what is a persona, how it's so very different than a profile. And most importantly, when you do the work and you have the persona documented, how you map it to your database so that it can be used for effective segmentation. Thank you for joining me.